Protests for democracy in Africa's last absolute monarchy. The king of Eswatini spends lavishly while most in his country live in poverty. Will he listen to the calls for change? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Eswatini is one of the world's last absolute monarchies. King Mswati has ruled the kingdom, previously known as Swaziland, for 35 years. But for the past week, people have been defying curfews to demand democratic reforms. They're angry at widespread poverty, while the king spends millions on private jets and luxury cars. Opposition groups say soldiers have killed dozens of protesters, and the government has denied reports the king has fled to South Africa. Eswatini's regional allies are calling for political dialogue to calm the unrest. We'll bring in our guests in a moment. But first, this report from Alexei O'Brien.
Anger and frustration in Eswatini. Crowds built barricades and burned tyres despite an overnight curfew and what the opposition's calling a tipping point for the nation. Demonstrations like this are rare in the small, landlocked country formerly known as Swaziland. But dissent has been simmering for years, much of it focused on King Mswati, Africa's last absolute monarch and one of the few remaining in the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, His Majesty the King of Swaziland.
He was crowned in 1986, aged just 18, and has unfettered political power. He has 15 wives and has been criticised for his lavish spending, while most in Eswatini live in poverty.
We are the youth of Swaziland, and we are so much depressed by the government. Whichever time, our government is not being fair. You get me? Our government is not being fair. It's just a one-man's land.
The protesters say they want democracy. Political parties are banned. And even though people are allowed to vote for members of parliament, the opposition says they're not elections, more selections of people signed off by the king.
Us as young people of the land, we don't want the king to be part of the government. And if you want to be part of the government, he must first be a citizen like the rest of us and go to work like every one of us.
Some shops in its two biggest cities have been looted and others set on fire. The military's been out to enforce a curfew, which the government says is to ensure the safety and security of residents. But the opposition says some protesters have been killed and many others wounded. The acting Prime Minister says he's open to hearing the people's complaints, but demonstrating isn't the way to do it.
We are a nation that believes in dialogue. Government has opened an email address where Mswati can continue to direct their concerns and petitions.
For decades, King Mswati's been portrayed as a deeply popular monarch. Now the government's been forced to deny reports he's fled the country. His kingdom appears to be in crisis. Alexei O'Brien, Al Jazeera.
All right, let's bring our guests into the show. Joining us on the phone from Eswatini is Mlungisi Makhanya, leader of the opposition PUDEMO party. In Cape Town, we have senior political and country risk analyst Menzi Ndhlovu. He works at Signal Risk. And in London, Christopher Vandome, research fellow with the Africa programme at Chatham House. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Mlungisi, first of all, in Eswatini. This is, of course, not the first time, Mlungisi, that we've had protests in Eswatini. Are the protests different this time round, though?
Indeed, the protest is quite different this time around. This time around, Swati is faced with a generation of young people who had to take some time to look at themselves and decide the top of future that they want for the country. and they arrived at a point that it cannot be business as usual, and they've got to take a step and a decisive step to lodge the final blow into the life of this evil regime.
Menzi, it sounds from what Mlungisi is saying there, this is quite serious. How accurate are the reports that protesters are being shot dead?
Yeah, so due to the closure of the internet and restrictions to communications, the number of casualties can't be entirely verified. But what I'm hearing from my sources on the ground, some of them who are family members, they can confirm that there has been some violence that has been enacted on protesters by the army and by police personnel. And this really is a trajectory or a tendency that we have seen amongst Eswatini police and security personnel throughout the reign of King Mswati. This tendency to respond with coercion to any kind of dissidents and any kind of grievances that are being publicly aired by the civilian population.
Christopher, it seems this time round the protests have been initially sparked by that government decree banning any petition for democratic reform. What prompted them to issue such a decree?
So what prompted them to issue a decree to restrict democratic reform? So I think this comes out of the protests that have been bubbling up following an incident earlier in May involving students in Eswatini. And off the back of that, we've seen this growing rise in protests. So it's not just what's been happening in June. This has been growing for some time. And I think that what's important here is to build on what Mlungisi has been saying, is the real importance of the role of the youth in these protests, and that where we've seen protests in the past that have been organized either by the trade unions or by others that have been very specifically targeted towards democratic reforms, but organized in a very kind of in a stricter way. These seem to be far freer protests, and we're seeing people say things and seeing people do things that is a little bit unprecedented in Eswatini.
But Christopher, my question is, if you're the government, why would you issue a decree to ban anyone even submitting a petition? Why wouldn't you at least go through the motions, accept the petition, and make the kind of statements it seems the government is now making, saying, hey, we hear what you guys are saying and we're looking into it? Why issue such a decree?
Because I think it's exactly what your guest from Cape Town has been saying, which is that there is a clear MO for the government of Eswatini throughout the last couple of decades, which is when they think that things are going to, when the pressure is starting to boil up, then they clamp down. And what's different here is that they tried that approach and they tried to get ahead of this, and they tried to issue that decree and they tried to quash it. But actually what's going on here at the moment is different to what's happened in the past, and they haven't been able to quash it in the same way. And it's resulted in the violence on the streets that we've seen. Right. It does seem like things are escalating. Mlungisi, are protesters still calling simply for reform, an end of corruption and so on? Or are they now calling for a complete end of the monarchy?
The call from the protesters have indeed escalated to the issue that they want a total abolishment of this thing of the monarchy. But just to add on what Chris was saying, what obviously has worsened the situation is the fact that the kids of the king have been living and posting on social media very obscene opulence at the face of grinding poverty for the ordinary citizen. And since these things were shown on the social media and the people were reduced to spectators when they see the royal family fleecing the economy, it arrived at a point where it became apparent to many young people that this is not just a royal family, but this is an institution of parasites that live off the sweat and blood of the ordinary citizen. So there's also been a lot of falsehood that had been said to the effect that Mswati is a popular king among the people of Swaziland. It has always not been true. Inkundla has survived for this long precisely because they've always made sure that they clamp down on any form of organization. So which explains why they took the decision to ban the issue of delivery of petitions, because through the process of delivering petitions, people were getting organized. And Mswati has always known that when Swazis are organized, it represents a threat to his...
Mlungisi, let me play devil's advocate here, since I should point out as well, we did reach out to the authorities in Eswatini and invite a government spokesperson or a government official onto this show, but unfortunately we didn't hear back from them. However, let me try and play devil's advocate a little bit here and present to you the government line. They say that, authorities say that they're simply applying law and order. This is not about suppressing people. This is not about squashing people. This is about establishing law and order. As you can see, they would point out in some of the pictures you've seen, looting. They want to prevent the country from descending into chaos. How do you respond to that?
I wish they had provided for you the earlier images of what was happening when the people were delivering the petitions, because there was never violence when people were delivering petitions. Violence started after government banned the delivery of petitions, and when the people insisted on defying that ban to go and deliver petitions, the police responded with brutal force, firing tear gas and shooting rubber bullets and even at times live bullets on peaceful protesters whose only cry was to insist on delivering petitions. But also I think it is important to speak to the excuse that they used when banning the delivery of these petitions, which was the spread of the coronavirus. In the last 2 weeks, the King's kids have hosted not less than 6 birthday parties, which were having huge audiences of their close friends and circumference. Now, it's not about people gathering. It is about denying the poor the opportunity to gather and express their frustration against this oppressive regime.
Well, talking about public appearances by the King, Menzi, why haven't we seen the King make any public appearance now, make any statement when, you know, the country's clearly being gripped by some serious turmoil?
I think more than anything, it's anxiety and it's unwillingness to come and step up and account for the actions of his government. And I think there might be an element of fear and an element of concern. And he's trying to wait for the situation to simmer down and for, I guess, this whole operation of law and order to take its course. And I guess in his hopes to establish some degree of calm before he comes out and says, okay, I'm here, let us negotiate a path forward. Whether or not this will arise during these circumstances, that is still on the balance. Historically, as Mlungisi has noted, I mean, pro-democracy sentiments in Eswatini are not something new. You know, it's a sentiment that folks have held for decades on end. And the monarchy has been able to ride these out through a combination of stick and carrot mechanisms. And in instances of unrest, there is a tendency by the monarchy to keep quiet until things are in order. So it is no surprise to us that the king has kept silent while his generals, while his police officials do the work, calm the population down. And then when things are a little bit calmer, he'll probably come out and speak out.
All right. Christopher, perhaps we should explain some of the political background to this story. Eswatini is a monarchy where the king is above the law and has absolute political power, right? This is the environment, the political environment we're talking about.
Yeah, so and this goes back to the period in which Eswatini, or then Swaziland, claimed its independence from the United Kingdom. It was a protectorate. And when that independence came under King Gabuza, who's Mswatini's father, there was a process of kind of nation building that involved a kind of strong cultural element. Of separating aside what is kind of typically Eswatini versus South Africa and creating that divide of trying to partition against what was then apartheid South Africa and creating this very distinct and separate country. And so the king's authority as an absolute monarch has been partly built upon this building of a culture and a cultural identity for the country and his place within it.
Right.
So there has been some form of democracy within the Tinkundla system, or this is what, the king has claimed as a form of democracy under the Tinkundla system, where you have people appointed, you have some elections, but as your piece at the beginning said, it's largely a selection process, but it's still under the control of the king himself. Now, where there have been protests or pressures before, including or especially around election times and from international corners around election times, this has forced at times a reaction from the king. For example, during or ahead of the 2013 elections is when he coined this term monarchical democracy as a way of categorizing the political system in Swaziland.
Right. Let me bring Mlungisi in onto this point that Christopher was talking about, the degree of, shall we say, a political process. But political parties were banned in 1973. So how do political parties like yours operate?
Thank you very much. And Chris is quite right. Political parties were banned in 1973 decree. But the party that I come from and that I lead, PUDEMO, does not even fall among the parties that were banned. A step further was taken by the king on PUDEMO in 2008 to criminalize PUDEMO. So we are a proscribed party. It is a criminal offense in Swaziland to belong to PUDEMO or to be seen wearing anything that has got an insignia of PUDEMO. And there is a history to this, because for the longest time, PUDEMO was the only active, potent political weapon in the hands of the democracy-aspiring people of Swaziland. Right. And it was for that reason that when the king realized that the most effective way of shutting the mouth of the people of Swaziland is to pass the Suppression of Terrorism Act, that effectively banned PUDEMO and their youth league.
All right, so avenues are being blocked. Let's talk a little bit about economics. Menzi, to what extent is economic hardship driving the discontent? Some estimates put poverty at above 60% and unemployment, depending on how you measure it, at 40%.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we can't discount the importance of economic factors being a key driver of the unrest at the moment. We've seen the Swazi state struggle to pay its workers, and that's led to a whole cluster of protests that occurred prior to this unrest that we're seeing. The state has struggled to pay teachers. The state has struggled to deliver services. All the while, as Mlungisi mentioned, the king and his close circles have been living opulent lives. So,
Menzi, did you think we'll see coordinated strike action?
I think in a sense, yes. I think there is a degree of coordination, or at least a confluence of demands. Previously, what we saw, at least from our side, was the strike action was relatively disparate. But when the Prime Minister issued that decree on the 24th of May, there seemed to be a coming together of forces. But at the same time, though, I think it's important to bear in mind that pro-democracy sentiments have been simmering in Eswatini for a while now. And I think that 24th of May decree was, to speak, the spur that pricked the sides of the Swati people's intents. And then, of course, there's the whole coronavirus pandemic, which has exacerbated socio-economic concerns in Eswatini. All the while, the king and his brethren, or the king and his close circles, have been living opulently.
Right.
And the state also received various channels of funding, for instance. They have yet to account for funding received from the IMF. And all this, right, these cluster of grievances,
that's all building up in the public psyche, no doubt. Yes. Let's bring in Mlungisi. We've just got a few minutes. We've heard opposition figures, Mlungisi, calling for South Africa to impose sanctions. Is that where the opposition is going? Is it counting on pressure from regional actors and international actors now?
Indeed, we are calling for decisive pressures from regional and international players. We are calling for targeted sanctions against the king and his close associates who are responsible for fleecing the Swazi purse. Because it is true that at the heart of this uprising is economic issues. The king has been, through the government, taking a lot of irresponsible loans because after they realize that they've emptied the coffers of the nation, the only way to access resources to steal was through very irresponsible and irrational loans. Yes, we are calling for the region. Yes, we are calling for the international community. But more than anything, we are calling for the criminal charges to be preferred against the king and this government because of all the murders that have been committed during this uprising. A lot of people have died here, and once the dust has settled, the international community will be shocked by the figures of the people who have been killed randomly by Mswati soldiers at the instruction of Mswati during this protest.
All right, Christopher, 90% of Eswatini's imports come from South Africa. 70% of its exports go to the Republic. The country Eswatini relies on aid and assistance from countries like the United States. How do you read the mood right now in regional and international capitals towards Eswatini?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And when we wrote our report now 8 years ago, we called it Swaziland, Southern Africa's Forgotten Crisis, for exactly this reason, that this has been bubbling along for a long time. And we were trying to garner some international attention on it because, for exactly the reason you point out, the international capitals, this is not high up on the agenda. I think what's really interesting at the moment is two things. One, as Mlungisi has said, this is a situation that has come out of the fact that the money that has been going into Eswatini now has not been used to deliver development. And citizens in the country are seeing what's going on elsewhere, and they're not feeling the benefits of development in the country. And that points to one person, which is the monarchy. Now, the relationship with South Africa has always been very complex. For multiple reasons. PUDEMO has a relationship with COSATU, who sit within the tripartite alliance in South Africa. Former President Zuma had his own personal relationship with the king. DIRCO has long been looking at the country, and in 2013 actually made recommendations to government that this needs to be something to be dealt with. But I don't think it's been clear within South Africa what they have in terms of diplomatic resources to be able to engage. And there's not been a clear or cohesive
They certainly got a lot of
from
economic clout, though, right? I think we've just got a minute left, and I want to give it to Menzi and ask this final question. We heard at the beginning of this show the call by Mlungisi that the protesters want the monarchy to go. Christopher's kind of outlined for us what the mood is of regional and international actors. Where do you think it's going to end? Will it topple the monarchy?
I think history warns us against having great expectations when events like this occur. In as much as there might be a massive call for change, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will occur. And we have seen the monarchy adapt itself to varying circumstances. So I would curb my enthusiasm, and I would expect it to be some kind of political process that leaves the monarchy intact somewhat, but perhaps with some greater allowances for political activity by the opposition and by civil society at large.
All right, it's been a fascinating discussion. I'm sure we could go on a lot longer, but I'm afraid we are out of time. So let's thank our guests for their wonderful contributions. Mlungisi Makhanya, Menzi Ndhlovu, and Christopher Vandome. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole Inside Story team here, thanks for joining us.